As the guillotine shadow stretched ominously across the tumultuous landscape of the late 18th century, the French Revolution engulfed France in the years 1789 to 1799. This period, marked by profound upheaval and the relentless clatter of the guillotine, spared few in its quest for radical change. Imagine the terror of living in Paris, the epicenter of revolution, where the air was thick with suspicion and the streets echoed with the cries of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Yet, amidst these cries lurked a more sinister undertone. The Reign of Terror, spearheaded by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, from 1793 to 1794, saw over 17,000 officially sanctioned executions, not to mention countless others who perished in prison or without trial. Can you fathom the paralyzing fear of being denounced by a neighbor or the horror of watching loved ones dragged away to face the merciless national razor? The revolution, initially a pursuit of liberty, soon devolved into a bloodbath of suspicion and tyranny. Names like George, Danton and Louis XVI, once powerful, now served as reminders of the fragility of life and power. Could you or I have survived this relentless purge of enemies of the revolution? The odds were perilously slim. The air was filled with the rhetoric of revolution, yet beneath it lurked a death sentence for even the slightest dissent. The Reign of Terror, a period of unprecedented brutality during the French Revolution, spanned from September 5, 1793, to July 28, 1794. Orchestrated by the Committee of Public Safety, it transformed the revolution from a fight for liberty into an era of relentless persecution and fear. This era's inception can be traced to the law of suspects passed in September 1793, which broadened the scope for arrests on vague charges of anti-revolutionary activities. The revolutionary tribunals, devoid of fair judicial practices, saw over 500,000 arrests with an estimated 177,000 to 40,000 people executed. Among the executed were notable figures like George Danton, a leading revolutionary who initially supported the terror, only to fall victim to it on April 5, 1794. His last words, "My only regret is that I go before that rat Robespierre," echoed the ironic fate that befell many revolutionaries. The terror was not just confined to Paris. In the Vendée region, a brutal civil war raged between revolutionary forces and royalist supporters. The repression was merciless and is remembered for its savagery. Entire villages were massacred in what some historians describe as a proto-genocide. In Lyon, over 2,000 people were executed after the city revolted against the Jacobin government. The city was even briefly renamed Viaroni, Liberated City, as a grim reminder of its punishment. General Francois Joseph Westermann, in his report to the convention after crushing the rebellion, chillingly wrote, "I have crushed the children beneath the horses' hooves, massacred the women. The roads are sown with corpses." This brutal suppression resulted in mass executions, and is often considered one of the first modern genocides. The guillotine, an infamous apparatus synonymous with the French Revolution, stands as a stark emblem of the period's turbulence and its approach to justice. Its role extended beyond a mere execution tool. It became a symbol of equality in death and a grim reminder of the consequences of dissent. The genesis of the guillotine can be traced back to Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who in 1789 proposed a more humane method of execution. Contrary to popular belief, guillotine neither invented nor was executed by the machine. The actual device was likely designed by Antoine Lavoisier and built by a German engineer, Tobias Schmidt. The first execution by guillotine took place on April 25, 1792, when highwayman Nicholas Jack Peller was executed in Paris. The guillotine debut was met with mixed reactions. Some found it distastefully efficient, while others viewed it as a democratization of capital punishment, a departure from the more gruesome methods reserved for commoners. The preparation for a guillotine execution was a process steeped in ritual and spectacle. Prisoners, including the likes of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, were typically held in the Conciergerie prison in Paris. On the day of execution, they were paraded through the streets in open carts, allowing the public to jeer and scorn. But the spectacle went far beyond mere punishment. It became an event. The tumbrils, as these carts were known, were used to transport condemned prisoners to their fate. These vehicles became a chilling part of the public execution process, filled with cries from both the prisoners and the watching crowds. As the tumbrils rolled through the streets, public reactions varied between vindictive jeering and solemn silence. The sight of the king's carriage or the queen's marked a moment in history, a moment that would be forever remembered. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI's execution was a particularly momentous event with an estimated 100,000 spectators. The king, before being silenced by the blade, reportedly declared, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." It was a final act of defiance, an attempt to protect the French people from further suffering despite the inevitable fate he faced. His words were drenched in irony, especially as they echoed across the streets filled with those who once revered him. As the revolution spiraled, the guillotine became the ultimate instrument of power and control. The executions grew more frequent, and more names fell beneath its blade, including those of Marie Antoinette, George Danton, and even the revolutionaries themselves, figures like Robespierre, who had orchestrated much of the bloodshed. In an ironic twist, Robespierre, who had once claimed the revolution would lead France to a brighter future, found himself victim to the very system he helped create. His execution, along with his allies, marked the end of the Reign of Terror on July 28, 1794. Even as the frequency of executions dwindled after the Reign of Terror, the legacy of the guillotine endured. The revolution's purpose of equality and liberty was marred by the terror of public executions. As the revolution waned, the guillotine remained a stark reminder of how the pursuit of freedom can be perverted into a tool of oppression. It stayed as the standard method of execution in France until 1981, when the death penalty was abolished. The guillotine's last execution took place in 1977, an eerie reminder of the revolution's long shadow over France's history. The guillotine became a focal point for public executions, especially during the Reign of Terror, from 1793 to 1794. It was in this period that the guillotine was most active, with thousands falling victim to its blade. The Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, was the primary site of these executions in Paris. The guillotine, with its swift and impersonal nature, was seen as an egalitarian form of death, erasing the distinctions between the nobility and the commoners. As the revolution advanced and radical measures took hold, the aristocracy and the clergy became the primary targets of this merciless instrument. The royal family, once untouchable and revered, was no longer exempt. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI, despite being the symbol of the old regime, was sentenced to death after a trial that charged him with conspiracy against the public liberty and general safety. The execution of Louis marked the fall of the monarchy, and his death symbolized the irreversible change in France's political structure. The act of publicly executing Louis XVI was a watershed moment, one that would alter the course of history. As he was paraded through the streets, and the public gathered in droves to witness his execution, his final words were, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." His statement, one of ultimate sacrifice, was drowned out by the sounds of the blade falling. This moment, etched into the collective consciousness, served as the ultimate symbol of revolution in France. But the royal family was not the only target. Queen Marie Antoinette, once loved and later despised, shared the same grim fate. Executed on October 16, 1793, her death marked the end of the monarchy in France. Her life, full of luxury and excess, was sharply contrasted with the way she faced her execution. As she was brought to the guillotine, she faced her final moments with quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the public hysteria that surrounded her. Her last words, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," are still remembered today as a poignant reflection of her final hours. The nobility faced a stark choice: flee or face the wrath of the revolution. Many who once supported the revolution fled in exile, while others, like the Duke of Orleans, who had once supported the revolution, paid the price for their beliefs, falling victim to the revolution's ruthless purges. In fact, even figures like Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, were not spared from the guillotine's blade, despite their valuable contributions to society. His execution in 1794 was a poignant reminder of the revolution's callous disregard for knowledge. As Lavoisier's famous words, "The Republic has no need of scientists," echoed across the streets. Through it all, the guillotine remained a powerful symbol of the revolution's demand for equality. The system of justice had devolved into a machine of political manipulation and bloodshed, and the guillotine's blade became an inescapable part of the equation. The notorious legacy of the guillotine haunted the revolution, and its omnipresence illustrated the stark contrast between the ideals of liberty and the brutal reality of enforcing them. Even as the revolution transitioned into a more moderate phase, the scars from the guillotine era remained, marking an era of profound political and social upheaval. In the late 18th century, as the French Revolution shook the foundations of society, an equally formidable adversary plagued the people: disease. This era, overshadowed by medical ignorance and rampant infections, saw countless lives lost not just to political turmoil but to the silent killer of illness. Smallpox, the era's great scourge, decimated populations indiscriminately. Despite Edward Jenner introducing the first smallpox vaccine in 1796, widespread skepticism and the slow dissemination of knowledge hindered its immediate impact. Tuberculosis or consumption was another relentless killer. Paris, the heart of revolutionary fervor, was a hot spot for the disease. The city's crowded faubourgs, teeming with the urban poor living in squalid conditions, were fertile grounds for the spread of this deadly respiratory illness. The poet André Chinnery, who fell victim to the guillotine in 1794, was a noted figure who suffered from the disease, his health deteriorating rapidly in the damp, overcrowded prisons. Hospitals such as Paris's infamous Hôtel Dieu were less centers of healing and more repositories of disease. In the annals of the French Revolution, the economic turmoil that unfolded is a tale of lofty ambitions and harsh realities. Central to this narrative is the story of the assignat paper currency issued during the Revolution, which became a symbol of the economic instability and monetary collapse that plagued France and exacerbated the suffering of its citizens. Conceived as a temporary measure in April 1790, the assignats were initially bonds backed by the confiscated church properties, a revolutionary act in itself. The government's decision to issue 400 million livres worth of assignats was a desperate bid to stabilize the national debt. However, the relentless demands of war and internal strife soon turned these bonds into regular currency. The revolution's escalating expenses led to rampant printing, with over 45 billion Levers of assignats in circulation by 1795. This unrestrained printing led to rampant inflation, a phenomenon aptly described by the British statesman Edmund Burke in 1790. They are under the necessity of becoming tyrants to support themselves as cheats. By 1796, inflation had spiraled out of control. The assignats had lost 99% of their value, plunging the French economy into turmoil. In the tumultuous years of the French Revolution, from 1789 to 1799, the prisons of France bore witness to a grim reality. Far removed from the lofty ideals of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The surge in incarceration, fueled by the radical policies of the time, transformed these penitentiaries into overcrowded dens of misery and despair. The law of suspects, enacted on September 17, 1793, drastically expanded the grounds for arrest, filling prisons to the brim. Historical records suggest that in Paris alone, the number of prisoners increased from around 1,000 in early 1793 to over 4,000 by the end of the year. Prisons like the Bastille, stormed at the Revolution's onset, and La Conciergerie became symbols of the Revolution's darker side. La Conciergerie especially saw a constant influx of prisoners, with figures like Queen Marie Antoinette and the Girondin leaders among its infamous residents. Within the walls of La Conciergerie, over 1,200 prisoners were crammed into spaces designed for far fewer. The overcrowding exacerbated the spread of diseases like dysentery and typhus. The spread of disease in such cramped conditions led to a devastating mortality rate. The floating prison hulks or pontons were a particularly horrific aspect of the prison system.